pride in what they were. And even though they're tiny compared to even ancient times, these people who kind of can be deemed insignificant in the world grand scheme of things was so prideful of what they are. And it's just an example as we go through each of these nations, and we're in Isaiah chapter 19. We're going to be reading verses 1 through 17. But as I was saying, each of these nations that we're going against is showing you a certain aspect of either the pride and arrogance that they have against God. It shows you a different aspect of the sin. It shows you our own nature and what we're like when we rebel against God. It gives you a very great idea of how the individual person and how they relate to God, which Isaiah chapter 1 through chapter 5 opens up and gives us a great example of the individual person and how the individual, when corrupted and turned away from sin, kind of leads out to the entire nation being corrupted and turned away from sin, and ultimately the deserving punishment that happens and the pain that is reaped inside it. And there's a lot of nasty things that happen when we lose sight of God. And it's just interesting to see that and to know as we read chapter 19 how to appropriately look at ourselves and look at the nation and look at what's going around us and say, this is the root of the issue. This is where sin's coming up, or this is just a certain part of it. And also to gain confidence in the Lord. Because chapter 19 is going to become crazy. There's going to be a lot of things happening. We're already talking about the defeat of Moab. We're talking about warning Ethiopia and not teaming up with Ethiopia. We're talking about the fall of Babylon before Babylon even becomes a thing. We talked about the destruction of Israel and the destruction of Syria. There's a lot of destruction and chaos going on, and to realize that we can still rely upon the Lord and the word of the Lord. And it's important as every day we wake up, we get even closer and closer to a international crisis with Russia and Ukraine. And people and their fear keeps on rising. And we're getting to another point in our history after a massive pandemic that is still out there. And there's still different variants and people freaking out as new variants are being discovered every day now, as new diseases are coming up and the threat of war. And our nation could potentially, not guaranteed, but there could be some issues in the future, and we could find ourselves at war yet again. And not necessarily to preach on that, but it is important to know that as we read chapter 19, that there is a God in control of all the chaos that we're going to read in this book and that is in our lives today. And we've been living through some tumultuous times since the year 2020, and to keep that in mind and to have faith and to know that there is an end. There is an end to the economic crisis that's going to happen. There's going to be an end to the political crisis. There will be an end to all things, and there is a beauty and a restoration. And we'll get to that next week in the end of chapter 19. It's a beautiful part. In fact, it's kind of like a reward for going through all the pain and suffering for those last few chapters. But it's still important to know that God is still the same God of mercy and love and steadfastness as he is in the beautiful parts of chapter 19, just as much as he is in the hectic parts of chapter 19. And it's important to keep that focus, and it's something that I lose often, and it's good to remind ourselves that God is the God of all times, and even the chaotic times, he is no more far away from us than in the good times, and that he is, in fact, I would even say more so present and more so involved in the lives of people in those chaotic times, because we find that Egypt gets redeemed by God, and a lot of that redemption comes from the eyes being opened up from the judgment that's happening and turning to the Lord. Now, of course, there is prophetic talking about the millennial kingdom, so it's not right away, right after this particular judgment happens. It's kind of hard to make a definitive stance on that. But we do see that the judgment of God comes and the redemption of Egypt comes after. And almost always, if we know anything with Israel, if we know anything of our own personal lives, that when we turn away from God, there is a judgment, there is a hardness, and then there's a repentance that almost always comes. The same cycle of humanity that is being followed in Egypt, and I think it's important to keep note on that, to kind of keep tabs that Israelites were not the only ones who fell into deep sin and had to be shaken up to be awakened from that and turn to God. But it's a deeply human pattern throughout all of history. And I think it's useful because once we understand that with Israel and we understand that with Egypt, we can see that in our own lives, in our own nations, in their own geopolitical turmoil that's happening today. So With that, let's pray. We have a lot to unpack, a lot to go over, a lot to consider. Our Father in heaven, thank you so much for today. Thank you for giving us the ability to come here. Thank you for making the road safe, that no one had any accidents as they get here. And thank you so much for the written word and the fact that you had your faithful servant Isaiah write these down for us, even the hard things, the things that are hard to swallow, the hard to consider, and the beautiful things of restoration and end times, and you bringing a peace and a lasting redemption to these people. And it's beautiful that even the classic enemy of the Bible is someone that you will redeem, that you will use, and you will build a highway from Egypt to Assyria, that we will be able to go to your holy city and be able to worship you, and that the Egyptians, the Ethiopians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians will all be born in Jerusalem on that day, and they'll be able to say that we are the Lord's, and there will be a restoration of the peoples, of the ethnic tensions going on, and you will set things, you'll set the world at peace. And there's a beauty in that, and also with that beauty, for our minds to be open and for our hearts to be open and to actually hear what you have to say. Remove me from this message. May I not be at all involved in it, but may your word, as plain and as powerful as it is, come through to speak to other people, and that we actually change our lives and live our lives with this knowledge. It's not something that's just wasted, and it's not just a thing that we come here just to spend our Fridays, but rather that you will radically change us and have us be able to carry it, even if it be into the chaos of the world, or into maybe a resolved peace, if it is your will. In the Lord's name we pray. Amen. So I'm going to be reading chapter 19, verse 1 through 17. I'm just going to read through it, and we'll stop, and we'll go through it again, verse by verse. So, verse 1, an oracle concerning Egypt. See, the Lord rides on a swift cloud and is coming to Egypt. The idols of Egypt tremble before him, and the hearts of the Egyptians melt within them. I will stir up Egyptian against Egyptian. Brother will fight against brother, neighbor against neighbor, city against city, kingdom against kingdom. The Egyptians will lose heart, and I will bring their plans to nothing. They will consult the idols and the spirits of the dead and mediums and spiritists. I will hand the Egyptians over to the power of a cruel master, and a fierce king will rule over them, declares the Lord Almighty. The waters of the river will dry up, and the riverbed will be parched dry. The canals will stink, and the streams of Egypt will dwindle and dry up. The reeds and rushes will wither. Also the plants along the Nile at the mouth of the river. Every sown field along the Nile will become parched, will be blown away, and will be no more. The fishermen will groan and lament, all who cast hooks into the Nile. Those who throw nets on the water will pine away. Those who work with combed flax will despair, and the weavers of fine linen will lose hope. The workers in cloth will be dejected, and all the wage earners will be sick at heart. The officials of Zone are nothing but fools. The wise counselors of Pharaoh give senseless advice. How can you say to Pharaoh, I am one of the wise men, a disciple of the ancient kings? Where are your wise men now? Let them show you and make known what the Lord Almighty has planned against Egypt. The officials of Zone have become fools. The leaders of Memphis are deceived. The cornerstones of her people have led Egypt astray. The Lord has poured into them a spirit of dizziness. They make Egypt stagger in all that she does, as a drunkard staggers around in his vomit. There is nothing Egypt can do, head or tail, palm branch or reed. In that day, the Egyptians will be like women. They will shudder with fear at the uplifted hand that the Lord Almighty raises against them. And the land of Judah will bring terror to the Egyptians. Everyone to whom Judah is mentioned will be terrified because of what the Lord Almighty is planning against them. All right. What a crazy thing to read. This is definitely a far cry from Ethiopia, who really didn't have anything against them, but rather talking about them coming to the Lord, giving themselves as a gift and an offering, and how Judah is not to align with them even so. And now God turns his focus to Egypt, who I said before is typically a symbol of the world, but right now is more literally just the nation of Egypt. I think it's very important when we read verse 1, an oracle concerning Egypt. See, the Lord rides on a swift cloud and is coming to Egypt. The idols of Egypt tremble before him, and the hearts of Egyptians melt within them. I think it's important to note is that Egypt is definitely one of the more, of course, well-known ancient societies. Just even to a person on the street would know about Egypt, or at least have known that they were an ancient empire. They have a lot of fame, and they're known for their riches, sometimes for the military, for their intellect, for their ability to have very wise counsel. They were known for their math, their ability to work things out. They were known especially for the engineering. They had one of the tallest buildings in the world for quite some time. They are a mighty nation, and a nation not to be messed with, and a very proud nation. And here we have in verse 1, when the Lord opens up to speak against Egypt, he talks about riding upon a cloud swiftly coming in, is that Egypt was wholly and completely unprepared for the reckoning of the Lord. In fact, this is a common theme we find in all of the nations, is that God comes and he comes to the nation and the judgment that they have, and they are living as if there is no tomorrow. Just like Moab, that was living and storing and had all their wealth and faith in the fortresses that they had and their army, just like how Judah even had faith. King Ahaz and his treaty in the alliance of Assyria, in which he had all of his faith in his 150,000 men who fell in a day. Just as Israel had faith in Syria, just how everyone turns around, they look at it, they say, hey, we are going to live our lives, we're going to institute our nation, we're going to go forward as if there is no God. We're going to turn our backs to the Lord, and we're going to be able to say, he is not among us, and we're not going to listen to his voice. And it's important to know, not only is this a national level, that there are dangers when a nation turns away and they stop listening to the Lord, when they start planning their own ways and saying, we're glorious, we're in our glory, we're the greatest there can ever be. And there's also troubles in our own lives when we live as if there is no tomorrow, as if there is no day of reckoning when the Lord will come and he will actually deal to us what we have put our consequences and actions into. We will reap what we sow. And I think it's important because a lot of people today, especially in society, we live where we absolutely hate the consequences, or try to do everything possible to avoid or explain away the consequences for our actions. Where we will sit there and we will say things that we get to choose our own future, we get to do what we want, but when condemnation comes their way, or when the trouble comes their way, they'll point around and say, hey, how dare you shame me for making this choice, or how dare this particular thing come and hit me, this is beautiful, this is something great. We see it everywhere, from documentaries talking about how prostitutes were getting murdered and killed, and they were spent half the documentary talking about how beautiful their sex working was and how this should be a right, but it was just done inadequately. It's important to know that every action we make will have a consequence, and it was said brilliantly by a pastor that we can make every decision on our own. We cannot choose or create or alter the consequence that comes with it. And there is a great danger to every single human being when we stop living without that knowledge. And the idea that God's going to come swiftly. He's going to come up to Egypt, he's going to come up to us, and he is going to make a reckoning, and he's going to make sure that the consequences and the actions we're doing will be sought through. And we like to tell ourselves, no, I can change the course of my actions, or if I do this and no one knows, it's not going to come and get me, or if I keep on doing it, and it hasn't happened to me yet, it's not going to happen. There's so many different excuses we give to each other, and I think one of the most stunning things I've ever had in my life is when I've done a sin against the Lord, and I said my flesh and my sin, wow, this evil thing that God warns against, nothing happened to me. It didn't happen yet, right? It came later, the consequence of that thing. But I remember thinking to myself, wow, this is great. This thing I should have been afraid of did not happen to me right then and there. Lightning didn't strike down, it didn't hit me, and I lived as if there was no tomorrow for that moment. And then God did. He woke me up and he sent something my way, and I suffered for it. And it's important to know, and it's important to keep our minds sharp, unlike Egypt, unfortunately, that no matter what, we can never avoid the consequences of our actions. God will always make sure it's seen out, even if we don't see someone else. Even if someone else seems to be getting away with it and it's not going to happen, the consequences will definitely catch up to him in death for sure when he meets the Lord face to face. There is no mistake. There is no ability to do this. And sometimes it shocks me when I listen to people who talk about it or don't even consider the consequences. And they say, you only live once. Why not try everything? Why not do this? Well, you don't try everything because when you shoot yourself in the foot, you know it's a bad idea, but you don't need to do it to know that putting, a bullet through your foot is not a good idea. There is many things that we can sit there and say, it is logical to deduce the consequence that is coming, therefore we shouldn't do it. And it's important because this also shows us, and we'll get to it when it talks about the wise men of Egypt, is that there are things we do when we're sinning that we, even with knowing the consequence, will still do it because we refuse to submit to the Lord. Egypt, as they're stumbling around like a drunkard, probably some of the wise men knew that what they were doing and how they were instituting their rules and their reigns was probably a bad idea, but they would do anything desperately not to follow the Lord. I think it's important. You can usually tell when you're doing something wrong or you're on the wrong path and you're definitely deep in sin when you're finding a kind of a desperate way to excuse the certain thing you do before the Lord. We sit there and say, well, this certain thing hasn't come yet, or I'm allowed to do this because of A, B, and C, and it keeps on coming up, and you keep on wrestling with it, and you keep on mentioning it, and you see the consequence, but obviously you're 1 in a million. It won't happen to you, but happen to everybody else. It's okay for you to pick up that alcohol bottle, or it's okay for you to go on that site and, on the gray areas and look around. There's a lot of things that we need to be on the lookout for. And to have an honest heart, an open heart with the Lord, so when he does come swiftly and those consequences come, that it will not be harsh and it will be with mercy and love because we're found in the Lord. And God's not afraid to give us what we deserve. He's not. He doesn't shy away from it. And if anything from the previous few chapters hasn't given you a clue that God is not afraid to tell you what's going to happen and that you have done it to deserve it, this chapter will definitely speak up to it. In verse 2, I will stir up Egyptian against Egyptian. Brother will fight against brother, neighbor against neighbor, city against city, kingdom against kingdom. The Egyptians will lose heart, and I will bring their plans to nothing. They will consult the idols and the spirits of the dead, the mediums and the spiritists. Even so, I will hand the Egyptians over to the power of a cruel master, and a fierce king will rule over them, declares the Lord Almighty. So Egypt, as God comes and he gives the declaration against them, he comes quickly as they live like there is no tomorrow. Their own sin, the pride of what they think, or even the bait, a civil war erupts in Egypt. One, I think it's very important to know that this is very specific on what happens. There's a civil war, they're fighting, and then a power comes in that takes them out, which is what happened with Assyria when he went and conquered Egypt. I think the footnote says 671 BC, and there was definitely a cruel master. But one, you can't just guess this. I think it's very important to know that the specific writing of it says that there will be a civil war, that they will desperately try to fix it, and the Assyrians will come and wipe them out. It's very specific of how Egypt will fall, but it shows us the conceitedness of the people, the inability to work together, the inability to want to move as a unit, and the desperation they have of when they come to end. Just like with Moab, they run to idols, they run to those who can speak to the dead, and they get nothing. And I think it's important that wherever God goes, there's usually, almost always, a unity. God does not call for division in people. He doesn't particularly like division. In fact, I think one of the most strong parables that really jumped out to me as I was reading this verse was when Jesus is talking about the man who owes a massive, insurmountable debt to the king, and the king forgives it. and then calls the servant who goes and tries to get someone else to pay him just a small little debt, a wicked man for holding on to that and not forgiving and begrudging others. It's not necessarily completely applicable to the civil war that happens in Egypt, but it is important to know that when God comes and he comes upon the Egyptians, they were unprepared for it, and even their great wealth and their great military and their great minds could not stop themselves from self-imploding. That their greatness and all of their fame that they are, still to this day we talk about them, still to this day we look at them, we still make movies about them, we still make movies about their dead with multiple different TV series. They come up in pop culture almost all the time. They could not stop or stand against the Lord, and because of their sin and their inability to go with the Lord, they fell. And I think it always happens that we like to look at the politics. Does it really matter why the Egyptians were fighting in a civil war? What was their main cause? What was their reason? We like to sit there and say, was one side right and one side wrong? But when you're outside of the Lord and division comes, no nation can stand. In fact, the more I study, the more I look at actual history, if the Lord is not with that nation and the nation doesn't want to be with the Lord, that nation does not stand anymore. It falls, it disintegrates. There is no reason for them to hold. The only reason why a nation retains its identity and holds its identity is because the Lord wills it. And we know this, and it's important to know that this is more so of a spiritual indictment on them and their inability to be with the Lord or want to have the Lord be their God, to bend their knee to him, that causes this absolute turmoil. And I think it's important to say, do you feel like in your own life you're going through a civil war? Are you continuously meeting a lack of unity? Sometimes that comes from simply refusing to bend our knee to the Lord. I know I've had a lot of sometimes arguments or silly arguments with people because I refuse to bend to the Lord or to admit I was wrong, or I'm not even right with the Lord. I don't even come and seek out after him, and I just want to fight and battle with people and have just take the fight to them and prove that I'm right. It's important for us to know that this disunity and this absolute destruction and chaos is caused completely and totally in part of their spiritual health with God. And I 100% believe that America's own instability and riots are coming from the same exact thing, our refusal to accept the Lord as God and Savior, and the needing to put man as our own God. We will face the consequence, and this is the reward of doing that. Not necessarily a civil war, but unrest, destruction, strife against each other. And listen, I'm going to tell you, it should be obvious, but the only friends the Egyptians have are the other Egyptians. The only friends the church has in this world are other Christians. The only friends a nation would have, the idea behind it is the time for Egypt to fight against itself was not then. The time for them to fight, to go against, to find an issue with them was not then when Assyria was looming over them and threatening to destroy them. The time for any of us to be fighting amongst each other or to find a reason to pick up and to pick an issue with another Christian or anything, it's important to know that unity and seeking after Christ and putting him in front is always the better option. And we get so caught up with the idea of who's right and who's wrong and losing sight of what the Lord calls us that it brings destruction. There is no good thing in holding a bitterness against your neighbor, against your brother, against another Christian, whether it be they're Calvinist or not, or whether they be Catholic or not. There is nothing that good comes from holding that bitterness and that resentment, and the inability to let it go will destroy you. And I think it's also important to note that there are things we can do in life that are absolutely worthless and do nothing more but exhaust us. I think this is kind of hard because when the Bible talks about going to idols and going to spirits of the dead and mediums and spiritists, our form of that has been so kind of changed and have done a different name that it's hard for us to immediately recognize our own idols or when we do this ourselves. I think easily we can talk about, if we want to change it and make it a more modern term, is turn to the internet. We turn to other people who have different ideas about what we should do, how we can live our life. We can turn to Instagram. We can turn to those like motivational 30-second videos on YouTube. We can turn to playing video games. We can return to our career and doing money. We can turn to almost anything in this modern age and make it an idol, or make it something that distracts us and turns us away from God, even in our worst moments. And instead of going to the Lord, instead of pleading with him, heal our nation, turn us, save us from this great enemy that's coming, that's going to be cruel, and it's going to be absolutely almost unbearable to be under the Assyrian king, that God could turn and repent to heal their nation. Instead of doing that, they do everything but turn to the Lord. And I've seen that in my own life where I've refused to turn to God. I've done everything in my power. I would say anything, do anything, even if it's not even logical, and waste my own breath and to tire myself out and to feel absolutely defeated and empty as I'm running to an idol or something that does nothing. And while we all know this, it's important to say it, the only thing of substance, the only thing of matter is the Lord. And to be careful what you esteem higher than the Lord. Be careful what you do. If you want to know, do I esteem something higher than the Lord? When you have a bad or hard day, where do you go to? Is it the Bible first, or do you turn on Netflix? What I do, sometimes I take a nap instead of reading the Lord. Sometimes I go and play a video game instead of going to the Lord. That the Lord is our source of life, our source of sanity. He is everything. He's the one and only. He's not the primary. He's not some side thing. He's the only thing in our lives. It is important to know that when we continuously get put in a hard time, a difficult time, where we turn to, where we're going is a huge indicator of where our hearts are, and if there's an idol, and if there's something, and if you do feel drained, if you feel like you're not getting something out of a life, if you're feeling like you are just wasting your time, it probably could be because you are and you're not going to the Lord. And it's important to keep this in our mind, is when the Lord comes, the judgment of Egypt comes, it's quick, it is fast. They fight against each other. They're spiritually unhealthy. They're completely turned against the Lord. And they go and turn and run to everything they possibly can that gave them comfort in the past, simply because the consequence of their action did not come soon enough. And let me say this. The reason why we turn to idols and things that are not the Lord is because the consequences of our actions are not immediately coming, or coming soon enough that pain could not be immediately felt to tell us that this is worthless. I think one of the most interesting things I heard is how some people do hunting, where they would take a massive salt block and they would put a blade in it. And I can't remember if it was a deer, but just for the sake, we're going to say it's a deer, or it could be an elk or some type of animal. They love salt, this particular animal that they're hunting, and they would come and they would lick the salt block, and they absolutely love it, and they'll keep on licking it, and it'll make their tongue numb. So as they're licking it, they will lick the blade, and it'll cut their tongue, but they won't know that. All they know is they're getting their delicious salt, and they'll keep on licking till they die, till they bleed out, and they're dead. And this is what's happening with Egypt. They are unaware and numb that the thing they're going to is worthless. It is inconsequential. It is empty. And we could do the same thing. Oh, it makes me feel good. We don't even realize the consequence of that blade and that salt block has always been there. We can't remove it. It will always be there. And it is an inevitability that when we keep on going, it's going to come. And sometimes it might be too late for us when we realize, oh, I'm dying. I should have gone to the Lord. But we're just so stuck in doing what we are. It's important. It's important to keep a look at ourselves and a look at the nation. What we're doing and where we're running to. And this is a continual theme of why Moab fell. They also ran to their false idols and their false gods. In fact, this is a continual theme. Why did Israel fall? Because they ran to Syria. They ran to false idols and false gods. They didn't have the Lord as their own God. Why did Syria fall? They did the same exact thing. They found strength in the unity of their alliance, and they found strength in all their false gods and idols, that when destruction came, they ran to nothing and tired themselves out and were completely drained and for nothing. They would die in front of their idols. Why did they die there? Because they chose to run there and they didn't run to the Lord, and the enemy was right behind them. It's a direct consequence of their action. And it's important. Our actions have consequences, no matter how long it takes for it to get to you. In verse 4, I'll hand the Egyptians over to a power of a cruel master, and a fierce king rule over them, declares the Lord Almighty. The waters of the river will dry up, and the riverbed will be parched and dry. The canals will stink, and the streams of Egypt will dwindle up and dry. The reeds and rushes will wither, also the plants along the Nile at the mouth of the river. Every sown field along the Nile will become parched, will blow away and be no more. The fishermen will groan and lament, all who cast hooks into the Nile. Those who throw nets on the water will pine away. Those who work with combed flax will despair, and weavers of fine linen will lose hope. The workers in cloth will be dejected, and all the wage earners will be sick at heart. And this is, as it's going forward for verse 4, the direct consequence of Egypt turning from the Lord is having someone else be put over them to wake them up, to punish them, to realize that their sin does have an action. Even worse than that is God then puts a curse upon the thing they rely upon the most, the Nile River. If you know anything about Egypt, they definitely worship the river. They found it to be flowing from a god of some sort. They found the actual river itself, I think it slowly evolved to become a god. The Nile River gave them everything. They gave them the ability to irrigate, to get their food, to get their own industry going. All of their cities were along the Nile River. It was a very important, and in fact, the lifeblood of Egypt. The reason why they could exist down there, the reason why they had a society there was because of the lifeblood of the Nile. And we often forget that physical things are not the thing that sustains us. I mean, to be fair, if you don't eat food for a certain amount of time, you will die. That's not what I'm saying. Rather, that's not the only thing in the world that sustains us. The reason why the Nile kept on flowing for the Egyptians was because the Lord willed it to. Because he kept on blessing them as they turned away and looked for him, and he kept on continuously blessing them. The reason why food sustains us is because God keeps on blessing us to keep on living. The reason why we all haven't died of heart attacks or because of a car accident is because God has blessed our travels and our safety. The reason why God still allows us to breathe is because he continues to have a purpose and a plan for us. Anything physical or in this world that we can look to and we can point to should ultimately point us to the Lord and what is happening. Yet God lets us know that there will be a massive drought in Egypt, and the thing that they depended upon, they looked to, and they claimed as a god, and they worshiped, and they held up high, will fail them. And a good question to ask is, when everything in this physical world fails you, you will actually see where you stand with the Lord. Sorry, I changed the question halfway through. The question is to ask yourself, is if you are to lose everything physical, will you still be able to rest content in the Lord? Will you still be able to find meaning in life? Will you still have a hope based in him? That's what we're called to find the Lord to be the one that completes us. He's the all-becoming one. To find that we have a completeness in him, there is a meaning in life, and that all else we should, if all else was taken away, be able to still preach that and believe that. And it's important because this river represents economic wealth. This river means literal physical health, for them to drink, for them to be cool, for them to be able to get a nice, cool bit of water. This river represents a lot to the people of Egypt. It is absolutely vital. And God is telling them that once it goes and he cuts that away, and he sits there and says, look, now you are left. When the thing that you were worshiping is gone, what do you do now? And the utter devastation. Wage earners could also mean weavers, but for this context, anyone who's making money, the industry of Egypt is put to pretty much a halt. Everything they're doing, their food, is blown away. It's gone. This is utter devastation. The same type of extreme devastation that was brought upon Moab, that was brought upon Israel, that will be brought upon Judah, that was brought upon Syria. It will be brought upon Babylon and will be brought upon Assyria It's the same type. Except it's different, is that God is specifically targeting their beliefs and what they rest upon that is not him. And he's specifically targeting the thing that they worship. I mean, there is so much to talk about these verses. What do you do when the economy is bad? Do you rely upon the economy? Do you rely upon your money more than the Lord? Do you rely upon your job more than the Lord? Do you rely upon the ability to get resources every day more than the Lord? Where do we stand in life? If the world will be hit in a great depression and we are to lose everything and our money is to be worthless, will we still be coming here to worship the Lord? Will we still be calling him Lord of all, or will we be kind of bitter with our eyes to the ground? The reason why Germany became the Nazi Germany that we know is because when everything hit the fan and they were unable to support themselves, they stopped looking to the Lord. They looked down to their worthless money. They looked down to the fact that the wheelbarrow that carried their money was more worth than the money itself. They looked at other people and got angry that they were doing better off than they were. They looked at themselves and said, how can we do this? And they did not look to the Lord. This is huge. Many nations, many societies have hit rock bottom, and Egypt is hitting rock bottom, and they are left with nothing because ultimately anything that is material, without putting its proper place and look upon the Lord, is nothing. And we ultimately know this. We get glimpses of this truth and this reality at funerals. We get glimpses of this and tragedies and war. All humans understand this suffering, and this idea is that there has to be something more than life than just these things that we can see and touch. I think even more terrifying are from verses 11 to 15. What do people of Egypt do when their great economic wealth is gone? What do they do when their water is soaked up, when their jobs are drying up, when unemployment's on the rise, they can't feed anybody, there's no ability to grow food, and they are having a civil war, and that there's a ruler coming in to put a cruel bondage upon all of their people? They turn to who? The wise men. They turn to themselves and say, I will make a plan. I will sit there and I will get myself out of the situation, out of this absolute pinch. We have the ability, we have the brains. And I'll let you know that these wise men of Egypt are well respected and well renowned for being absolutely intelligent. These are Harvard level professors. These are some of the greatest men of their age. These are people that are still fabled, that were able to build the beautiful pyramids. They were able to figure out how to do certain math. I mean, these are highly intelligent people. If there's any group of people who could intellectually think themselves out of a situation, it would be Egypt. It would be these wise men who they turn to and say that these people can do it. These are our last hope. These are the people who have reserve plan upon reserve plan. These are the people who have been founded and kind of, you can even say that descended from the knowledge and the wisdom of Joseph, who helped Egypt get through a drought before. These people have got it. And God says the officials of Zone are nothing but fools. The wise counselors of Pharaoh give senseless advice. How can you say to Pharaoh, I am one of the wise men, a disciple of the ancient kings? In this pinch of this economic complete failure, of all these things falling apart, of the issues that are coming up, we like to say in ourselves, we can be just like a Jacob, we will make a plan, we will get out of this. What can I possibly do to avert this instead of turning to the Lord? And it's said many times throughout the Bible, a consistent teaching that if you do anything without the Lord, without coming to him or having him be a part of it, it is nothing. If the best Marines in the entire world decide to guard a house and let's say every single military of every single nation is guarding one strategic point, but God says this point will fall, every single nuke, every single tank, and every single bullet will fall short, and that place will fall. We often forget that without the Lord, without his wisdom, without specifically going and turning to the Lord, that our best and our greatest minds can do nothing. Not only that, but when we hold ourselves above our own stature of humans, when we don't have the Lord as our guiding wisdom point, we truly do nothing more but speak folly. Because we are deceiving ourselves. Why? Because we want to not live in condemnation of our own sin. We want to be able to excuse what we're doing. We know the word of God that's written upon our hearts. We see it in the stars and all nature around them. These wise men knew and understood that the things they were doing were sinful. They would have some idea of it because surely they gave judgment upon other people and how they lived. And that means simply by following the biblical concept of judgment, that they are then able to be condemned by their own standards. They understood what it meant to fail or fall short of their own standards, and they were just like every other human. When they sin and they understand that they are breaking the holy law of God, they deceive themselves, and it's that base of deceiving themselves, of trying to fool themselves that, no, I'm actually righteous. No, I'm actually able to stand with a clean conscience. No, I'm actually the greatest with that knowledge and that gnawing kind of a conscience that God put in every human being, talking to them, saying, no, you have offended the holy God. There's nothing you can do. You've fallen short. You and yourself cannot do anything. It's important to know that since they've deceived themselves, there's no way that they can guide anyone out. It's important to know that anyone who isn't saved, I highly doubt their ability to guide themselves out of a situation. Because if you're not saved, you're first deceiving yourselves that you're in right or that you are doing well with your sin. And you're not dealt with the most important thing in your own life, the most important issue, which is sin. If you're not taking care of that, if you're not resting soundly upon the word of God to know that you have been redeemed from that, you're deceiving yourself and are doing and making excuses of why you're doing that, how you're doing it, and why you are righteous in that option. And because they do that and they understand that they are sinning, but they refuse to come and they refuse to bring it to the Lord, they've deceived themselves, and so therefore they're the ones who hopelessly deceive Egypt in return. Because a deceived person cannot guide anyone to safety. And we see this easily in verses 12 through 15. Where are your wise men now? Let them show you and make known what the Lord Almighty has planned against Egypt. The officials of Zone have become fools. The leaders of Memphis are deceived. The cornerstones of her people have led Egypt astray. The Lord has poured into them a spirit of dizziness. They make Egypt stagger in all that she does, as a drunkard staggers around in his vomit. There is nothing Egypt can do, head or tail, palm branch or reed. The greatest men, the greatest minds of Egypt have deceived themselves, refused to admit and turn to God with their sin, and with that have created the same deception and have carried along to everybody else. And what is happening, what they would call splendor, what they would call grandeur, as they deceive themselves, is when you look at it through the Lord's eyes, it's nothing more than moving around in their own vomit. And I think it's important because we like to talk about, the glory of ancient Egypt. Look at the pyramids that still stand. We still talk about it as glorious. We still have in our pulp culture, when we write about it and the ideas of, this is something that is glorious, we like to look to ourselves. We like to look at our own universities, our own science. We like to sit there and say, this is something glorious, this is something good. But when you look at it and it's apart from God, and you are not facing or going against the greatest issue in your own life, which is sin, and are trying to figure out another issue without solving the primary issue, you're doing nothing more than staggering around your own vomit, moving back and forth, completely lost, and have done nothing but shame their own nation. And we can see this. Their intelligence was not able to save them from the drought, was not able to save them from their civil war, and was not unable to save them from the Assyrians. and were to shame themselves. Because these people were well known throughout the entire world, they were heralded as the best, and they looked like utter fools, unable to pull it together. And it's important. I mean, again, just like with verses 5 through 11, we're merely just skipping the very tops of it, the very basic. I mean, there is so much to talk about, to consider and to think about. But with this, who are our nation's cornerstones? Who do we look to? And those very people, are they leading the nation astray? Are they leading America around in its own vomit, thinking we're glorious, and we refuse to admit and see the sin of ourselves? And don't be deceived. Even sinners can see very obvious and blatant sins, and they will excuse others. Don't be deceived by the fact of, we can see this one crime, this one sin against America pretty clearly, so we see it all. By no means. We can very easily see the fault in others, but not in ourselves, and therefore we have an entire nation refusing to see many various different faults because they refuse to bring it to the Lord. Who are our cornerstones? Who are the cornerstones in your own life? Who do you rely upon and say, this is my cornerstone? And I would caution you to make sure that whoever that is, that you seriously bring it before the Lord, because those people can very easily lead you astray. They can tell you the wrong thing, you can put trust in them, and they can go against you. I would even say that the only cornerstone you should have is Jesus Christ. I would go as far as to say that, and that you should not rely upon anyone else, be that your father or your mother or a very close friend or relationship, wife, spouse, boyfriend, girlfriend, whoever it is, whoever they are, but rather the Lord, for he shall not lead you astray. And it's easy to say that, but it's hard to practice it. It's extremely hard. I myself know that I am human and I am drawn by other people who I think are smart or better than me, and I will listen to them and treat them as my cornerstone in my life and will follow after their advice instead of the Lord's. It's a call to continuously look at, where are we looking to? I mean, with Egypt, it's shown us they looked to their own intellect. They looked to their economic wealth. They looked to the river. They looked to their physical items and say that this gift that is given from God is absolutely beautiful, is sustaining us. This is the thing that we will hold to, and God is putting an indictment against their brains, which God gave them to as a gift, and their material wealth that God gave them to a gift through the water and through the industry that it created. And instead of honoring the Lord with it, they honored themselves, and it got them nothing. They staggered around. With this aside note, as I was really thinking about the gift of God that I've completely taken for granted lately, that's trees. I mean, think about the gift and grace that God has done in just a tree. Something that rejuvenates the air, gives us fresh air. Certain trees can give us food. I mean, it's entirely dependent upon a tree for our ecosystem in the world. Not every part, but a large, vast part of the tree has a lot to play. I mean, how often do we sit there and we look at even water or food or the air currents, the water currents? How often do we even look at water or anything that God has given us and actually given him the glory through it? And especially as I read through 5 through 11, I've really spent a lot of time and consideration on the things that I rely upon, whether it be natural, like the Nile River. And what do I do to actually give God honor with that? What do I do in my job to give God the honor with that? What do I do with my brains, with my intellect? How do I actually focus it and keep the focus upon the Lord so I don't stumble around? How do I keep this focus of this great many things, even as something as simple as a tree or a bird, and to honor the Lord through it and to give it to him instead of capturing it, holding it as my own, and watching it as it all fades away because it never was mine to begin with? Particularly the sin of Egypt is laying claim to something that isn't theirs. And I think it's important to say it now, but your intellect is not yours. The physical wealth and the world around us is not ours. Our own gender identity, our own sexual identity, or any identity is not ours, but the Lord's. And as soon as we turn around and we try to take control of what that is and say, this is who I am, or this is how I decide, or this thing is mine, or this plot of land is mine, if it's not given to the Lord and we treat it as our own, it leads to disaster. And that is the sin, or the main issue that God is indicting against Egypt that I see. They take too much hope, too much stance, and everything else but God. So then ultimately, verse 15 through 17 gives us the very consequence that they chose from the very beginning, the grand summation of their entire civilization, and the judgment. It's not everything, because we still have God on the throne. And I'll mention that yet, but we won't read that part of the chapter. But there's nothing Egypt can do, head or tail, palm branch or reed. And that day the Egyptians will be like women. They will shudder with fear at the uplifted hand that the Lord Almighty raised against them. And the land of Judah will bring terror to the Egyptians. Everyone to whom Judah is mentioned will be terrified because of what the Lord Almighty is planning against them. Their ultimate indictment of all of the decisions they've made, of all the things they've done, of everything that they have been gearing and coming towards, but they believe that the consequences will not catch up with them, that there is no tomorrow, and that they can live, and you only live once, and they'll live it up in the richest and most powerful nations that are still affecting our culture even to this day. They can do nothing, and they come to nothing. And that ultimately is what they decided and what they knew they were heading towards. And at a certain point, they couldn't stop it. I think it's very important to keep note. There is a certain point when you cannot return back. I mean, you can be redeemed. Just read verse 18 or read the end of 19. God redeems Egypt. God pulls them back. But there are certain choices that you make where you cannot undo the consequences coming the way. You can still be redeemed by the Lord. You can still find your way in heaven. You can still be seated at his throne, but there are certain consequences in your life that you cannot reverse. A great example of that is someone in my family who unfortunately murdered someone. And while he came and found the Lord in the jail, he cannot reverse or change the entire system of the fact that he killed someone and he now should stay in jail for the rest of his life. There's many examples of that where we cannot reverse. And there's a time when there's nothing you can do but face the consequence of the choice that you have made. But take careful note that this chapter does not end on verse 17. And God could have ended there. In fact, there is no reason that the Egyptians gave God to say anything else beyond verse 17. There is no hope. There's nothing that they have done or deserved that God would keep on going and would say, but even still, he will redeem them. He will change them. And he will uplift them. And it's important also when we pay attention to the very last two verses in that day, it's talking very specifically about a day. We're talking about the millennial kingdom. It is changing tones. We're looking more towards the future, and it changes the tone, and it will repeat that again. And verse 18, when we come up next week in that day, it will let us know that there is still a future and still a time for Egypt. That just like Ethiopia, they will be in the millennial kingdom and God will restore them. But even still, they'll have judgment against them. I think I hit all of my points. Yeah, but keep in mind that even with all of this, God can redeem it. So at least for me, when I read Psalm 87, I mean, we can probably even read it again because it's very powerful. It really spoke out to me because I've been reading through the Psalms. It actually almost knocked the wind out of me when I read it. And we read it last week. Psalm 87, verse 1. He has set his foundation on the holy mountain. The Lord loves the gates of Zion more than all the dwellings of Jacob. Glorious things are said of you, O city of God, Selah. I will record Rahab and Babylon among those who acknowledge me. Rahab, by the way, stands for Egypt. Philistia too, and Tyre, along with Cush, and will say, this one was born in Zion. Indeed, of Zion it will be said, this one and that one were born in her, and the Most High himself will establish her. The Lord will write in the registers of the people, this one was born in Zion, Selah. As they make music, they will sing, all my fountains are in you. This psalm is talking about the Egyptians, the Babylons, all of the ancient enemies of Israel. Some of them turning their lives, devoting themselves to God, being found born in a part of the people of God. They're redeemed. They're born in Zion, that God himself is writing in the book and saying, hey, this person, this Egyptian, has found me, has given, and has turned his life to me, and he is in Zion, that in the millennial kingdom, they will be there, and that God will restore ultimately all of the nations that we're reading. And I think it's important to keep that in mind, is that there's a purpose to God's judgment. There's a reason why God caused drought. There's a reason why God caused civil war. And there's a reason why God calls out the wise people. It's not random happenstance. We have a God of order and a God of absolute perfect intellect. And I would encourage you on just the small points that we kind of skimmed through to really dive deep into why did God use these punishments? How can it speak to us, and how can we also be able to use that, kind of that lesson we learned from the Egyptians, to become better people of God? And that's all I'd have. So we're getting ready for our prayer requests. So